The trade deadline has passed, and we here at the Women's Hockey Report are going to give you an update, plus what's going on in the Frozen Four, all that and more on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
This is the Women's Hockey Report, presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report, brought to you by the Locked On NHL channel, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And I am Erica L. Ayala, once again with Rachel Donner, and we do our vibe check. I'm bummed that we're in two different locations. I mean, last episode was so much fun on the Takeover Tour, or at the Takeover Tour stop in Raleigh, Rachel. But what's good in your world?
Yeah, I think, with the PWHL Trade Deadline and roster freeze, it's hard with so few teams to expect a lot of action, but yet we're conditioned to do so. So I have mixed feelings about this trade deadline, especially
Indeed.
given where the standings are,
Yes, indeed. And let's get into that exactly. So the trade deadline has just passed at the time that we are recording on Friday. And we did see some moves. So there was a proper trade between two teams. And then you mentioned also the roster freeze, which was more of what we saw. So let's talk about, Rachel, the first or the only real trade that we had in the PWHL.
Yeah, so there was kind of a minor trade between Montreal and Toronto where Kaitlin Willoughby went from the Scepters to Montreal forward in exchange for defender Anna Kjellbin. And I think that this was just a depth move for both teams here, just shoring up those particular roles on their team. I would say that, Kjellbin is probably the more impactful of the two moves here, just because you can always go for more defense on your team, and given her background and experience. But these are older veteran players that are exactly what you want to see, join your team to just help bolster your team heading into a playoff run.
Yeah, for sure. Not sure that we're going to see either necessarily light the lamp with their new teams here. Right. But yes, shoring up defense, we know that that's what you need for a playoff run. We've talked a lot about Montreal and how they've been able to more so survive games, especially early on in the season, which allowed them to collect points when other teams were kind of losing outright. So I think that's an interesting move for sure. Of Kjellbin, Anna is a right-handed D, brings international experience, and is a proven leader as captain of Team Sweden. That's what Gina Kingsbury had to say about her new acquisition. And then Danielle can you say her name for me? I'm going to have to edit this.
Danielle Sauvageau.
Sauvageau. Is that how? Okay. Danielle Sauvageau said Kaitlin's arrival allows us to add even more depth to our squad. You mentioned that, but both teams are visibly happy with the additions, answered both of our needs. And that's an interesting quote because I think that there's still this feeling out phase, and this, when you have a league that's owned by a single owner, I think there's more of these, maybe we even call them, at least as of now, cosmetic moves, as opposed to moves that are going to be truly to support and bolster individual teams. So, I mean, that's kind of my reaction to your point about maybe the lack of movement in the PWHL at the trade deadline.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple other smaller moves there, especially by the New York Sirens, but
they're trying outright. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're just trying to kind of move some pieces around to set themselves up for the future. This had really nothing to do with this year overall, and I think that that's just kind of what this league is right now, and things are so tight amongst the top teams that the fact that there was a trade even between Montreal and Toronto, two of the top teams, I think is a big deal, but it's a small deal in terms of what actually took place. So it is just a growing league, and when you don't have as many teams, it's hard to have an impactful move that isn't going to be kind of a win lose situation when you're in competition so closely.
Yeah, I wonder also if, and we're still hoping to talk to one of the scouts from one of the PWHL teams, but I do wonder if there's enough bandwidth, and if the teams and the league are really tapping into the wealth of um, you know talent that has existed in women's pro hockey. You talked about some of the players that have been, or the players that were involved in the trade. you know um these are 29, 30-year-old players, and in women's hockey, women tend to peak later, so being on quote unquote the wrong side or close to 30 is actually more of an advantage in the women's game than we tend to hear it talked about in the men's game. So I just think that hopefully it goes back to something Kendall Coyne Schofield said, and that they'll be able to bolster the reserve players, or maybe even just expand rosters. But also, I wonder what talent acquisition is going to look like. But, you mentioned New York, and they made two changes to their roster, and they added Lauren Bernard, and then also signed, Alexi Gay as a practice player. That did that. Does mean that Olivia Knowles moves to the practice squad because of the Bernard signing. But Bernard and Gay, both defenders, and so once again we see teams making a move to shore up the blue line.
Right, and with the Bernard signing in particular, Pascal Daou, the GM, said specifically, this is about player development,
Mhm.
right? So she's going to join the team. She's a rookie, strong background with Ohio State. Don't get me wrong, but she hasn't played yet for New York. Her last game was February 1st for Toronto because she was signed off the practice team from Toronto, and this is just about getting a younger player more exposure as opposed to being stuck on a practice squad.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely interesting. And we kind of, saw a few other changes, like Kelly Babstock, who actually check out, we'll have some additional content. I was able to speak to Kelly Babstock in Seattle. And at the time she was on a 7-day contract with the Boston Fleet, but she's an OG Quinnipiac alum, has been through, of course, the NWHL/PHF. Definitely a gritty sandpaper style player. Was
Yes.
not only one of the leading scorers in the former league that preceded the PWHL, but also was up there in penalty minutes as well. Heading into such a crucial part of the season, we knew Kelly Babstock would bring the spark we needed on and off the ice, is what we heard from Boston regarding this signing. We also talked briefly about that they had added Jillian Dempsey as well. So I think that what we see from Boston, especially with Babstock at this trade deadline, is they want some grit, but they also want some veteran players. So that's a little bit different than what we're seeing from New York, but that probably, Rachel, has to do with that New York in the standings versus Boston in the standings. It's a different picture.
Right. And I think it's really interesting that Boston made this choice. And, you know, y- neither of these players are going to get a ton of ice time here, but the fact that very similarly, Kelly Babstock and Jillian Dempsey are those veteran leaders. They just have completely different styles of play, and that they chose to kind of go with Babstock and her borderline, kind of on the edge style of play on the ice, as opposed to Jillian Dempsey's more like tried and true steady style
Yeah.
of play out there. I think it's a really interesting decision that they've made headed into the home stretch.
Indeed, indeed. We'll see how it pans out. And then we also saw that Ottawa made a change. They picked up a reserve player from Minnesota, which is very interesting given the history of these two teams just in the last handful of days. But unfortunately, Rachel, it also comes with the news that Emerance Maschmeyer, who did leave the game against the Minnesota, I almost said Minnesota Wild, against the Minnesota Frost earlier in the week with an injury, she now is on LTIR. So Lucy Morgan comes to Ottawa, presumably to be a goaltender that will play alongside Gwyneth Phillips here. But, was a reserve player, had 29 saves and a 5-0 loss to New York, comes from the University of Minnesota, also played at, or I guess comes to the PWHL immediately from University of Minnesota, also played at St. Lawrence. We'll talk about both of those teams and programs later. But good that they were able to get a player before the roster freeze, but also it's a pretty big blow to think that you won't have Emerance Maschmeyer as you're really trying to claw your way up even just a little bit in the standings.
Yeah, it's, again, this just shows the level of quality of goaltending in this league because Lucy Morgan was a reserve player who had an incredible record at Minnesota last year with a 1.65 goals against average, a 931 save percentage. And her career before that at St. Lawrence, a 1.99 goals against and a 928 save percentage. Just a phenomenal goaltender here. And yet she was a reserve player in the PWHL. And you obviously hate to see Maschmeyer be hurt like this and be on LTIR, and it is going to affect Ottawa. But I do think having this signing and giving Lucy Morgan a shot is going to be good for the league, especially as they look toward expansion, and it'll give her a showcase.
Indeed. And we still have a few weeks before we're expecting an announcement about perhaps an announcement about expansion or a decision at least. So I mean, overall, the deadline wasn't much as far with regard to trades. Again, some roster moves for sure, but trades not so much. I do think, as I said earlier, it has at least a little bit to do with that. I don't know that there's necessarily a drive or incentive in the way that we think about it for the NHL or other leagues where there are owners that can kind of do their own research and navigate all of that when you have a single owner. That being said, I mean, it is an interesting thing to think about, but that's not to say, Rachel, that these teams don't want to compete for a Walter Cup. I think we just have to get through a few more seasons before we really understand what that's going to look like for the PWHL. And I think also it seems like from our conversation with Kendall Coyne Schofield and Malika Underwood, where we had them on the program, these are some of the things that the Players Association is also thinking about.
Yeah, I think so as well. It's very interesting at times here.
Indeed, indeed. And we have to talk about some teams that didn't necessarily make too many moves, but we'll do that once we get a little deeper into the show and then of course give you our game of the week. But coming up next, we actually got to speak to Ella Hartje. She's one of the forwards for the New York Sirens, and we're going to play a snippet of that interview coming up on the Women's Hockey Report.
If you're like me, your mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee, but I got tired of settling for the basic grocery store pods that just weren't cutting it, and that's why I turned to Trade, and let me tell you, their coffee is next level. Trade is the #1 specialty coffee marketplace in the US. It brings you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees. They curated over 450 amazing roasts, and whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you like, they can handpick the perfect match for you. I found a local Philadelphia roaster, Reanimator, that I had always wanted to try, and my first bag of theirs was a game changer. It had such a smooth flavor, and I could actually taste the difference from those pods. The subscription makes it so easy as well. There's no more last minute grocery store runs or settling for whatever on the shelf. So right now, Trade is exclusively offering listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com/lockedonnhl for 40% off your first order. Drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when that first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who might cut down that net. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when I win, I get paid instantly. There's no waiting around. So visit fanduel.com and get in on all the college hoops action all tournament long.
All right, we are back here for the Women's Hockey Report. And Rachel, earlier this week, I was able to have a great conversation with Ella Hartje. She's a rookie for the New York Sirens and is also a Detroit native, which if anyone watched the PWHL draft, then you know that because she definitely put on for Detroit with her outfit and has promised that she will have a very special outfit curated by her sister for the upcoming takeover tour stop in her hometown. Here's our conversation with Ella Hartje. There's so many things that I would love to chat about when it comes to you, your path, some of what's happening in the PWHL. But first, I just like to kind of do like a little bit of a vibe check and get to know a little bit about you by asking a pretty open-ended question. I call it my brown sugar question because it comes from a movie called Brown Sugar. But hey, Elle, tell us, when did you fall in love with hockey?
Oh, that's like an interesting one because I feel like it was before I knew I did, if that makes sense. So my dad was a professional hockey player, and so he put all of us in skates before we even remembered doing it. But from what I hear, I took to it immediately versus my older brother who used to cry and like throw a fit when they would bring him to practice. I loved it right away. So I would say immediately. And I think that love for the game shows in my decision to continue to play hockey throughout my life because I played a lot of sports and I played hockey, soccer, and tennis like very competitively at the same level for a long time. And then obviously you do eventually get to a point where you have to drop one. You can't, there's literally not enough time in the day to do all of that. And so tennis was the first to go. I had realized I was a team sport girly through and through. So then I was travel soccer, travel hockey all through high school. And then I even was doing recruiting visits for soccer and for hockey. So I toured different schools for soccer, different schools for hockey. I was touring some schools thinking of playing both. And ultimately my passion for hockey, I think I always knew it, but it was kind of just keeping the door open. And then, you know, I knew that hockey is what I wanted to do. And I wanted to make sure that all of my focus was on hockey. So I kind of dropped the idea of doing dual sports in college too. Like I really wanted to focus on hockey.
So like, when did you really understand what it meant that you had a parent that played professional sports?
Yeah. Well, let me shout out my mom too. She's also a lawyer. So
hey, there you go.
That is my other passion. I was a poli-sci major at Yale. Might even consider law school in the future. I just love law and I loved growing up around my mom. She's my role model. So I did want to give her a shout out.
Yes,
but to answer your question about my dad, I actually think it took longer than I would have thought for me to realize how cool he really was. Because when you're growing up, he's just your dad. And when I was growing up, he was done playing. So I didn't grow up with him in those spaces. He was just my dad and he was my coach. So I think it really took, and he's really humble, so he doesn't talk about himself. So there's like all of those things coming into play. So it took me, he wrote a book and I ended up reading his book in middle school. And I kind of was just like, whoa, like you're awesome. So then we started having conversations about his playing time, his experiences. And I think just the older you get, the more you can come to appreciate the things that your parents did. The less they the less there's sort of these enigmas that you don't understand what they're doing. They're just your mom and dad, and the more you can really understand like the nuances of where they came from and what they've done.
I think it's fair to say that women's hockey's been through some things, you know. We've seen a lot. But every step has been growth, and the PWHL, of course, included. So, you know, what made you confident to be able to, or even maybe kind of changed your perspective on what was going to come after Yale?
Yeah, I think I really started to believe that I might actually pursue hockey after college my junior year. So pretty late in the game. One of my really good friends, Claire Dalton, she plays for Montreal, and she was a class ahead of me. So when she was a senior, her plan was to continue to play, and this was before the league was even announced. And I just saw, like, I talked to her a lot about it, and we were like, why rush our lives when this is our passion and this is something we love to do? So that was one of the things. And then the other thing is my family was really supportive. They were like, you obviously aren't done playing. Like, you still have so much love for the game. You're so committed to getting better, and you still have more to give. And my dad, like I said, was a professional athlete. My mom was there to support him along the way, and she had her own ambitions. And they were like, don't let sort of, not stereotypes, I can't think of the right word, but don't let what you think life is supposed to be get in the way of your path. And so that was sort of a conversation we had, and I'm so happy that we did, and that they were supportive of me pursuing this, because I think if they were like, nope, you gotta get a finance job in New York City, and they weren't supportive, then I would have second guessed and maybe not gone all in on this. But that was instrumental in me deciding to keep playing.
You're fit for the drafts. It's kind of, you know, become a part of, you know, how people know you and identify you. But I want to use that as a transition, because you actually are one of the players on this takeover tour that's going to have a chance to play in a city as a pro athlete in this league, in a city that you call home and that has meant so much to you as a person. And I'm assuming also as a hockey player. You'll be taking on Minnesota. I mean, how many folks are pulling up? Let me know who's coming through.
Oh my gosh, I felt like I was a logistics specialist. Like, I'm getting texted left and right, like, hey, can you get us tickets? Like, we want to sit close to the glass, blah, blah, blah. So I'm like reaching out to teammates who might not have family coming. I'm like, can I have your tickets? I was really, really working hard getting those comp tickets in. So I'm really excited. I mean, I've gotten like such an outpouring of support for this upcoming game. I know a lot of like my youth organizations that I was involved in, and I played for a boys team my whole life. And I like all of the parents from that team are going to come, and my family and my trainers from home, and just, yeah, it's going to be big squad rolling out on Sunday.
You know, let's talk a little bit about this Sirens game. You know, we mentioned, of course, the takeover tour. It will be stopping in your hometown. You know, this is a team that I think, like a lot of teams, has been trying to figure out what their stride is. The standings have been so tight for so long. What do you like about what you've seen from the team, and what are the areas that you think the Sirens really want to just refine and focus on as the regular season starts to wind down?
Yeah. Well, I would say, for one thing, win or lose, the attitudes that we have showing up at the rink are great. Everyone shows up and wants to get better and wants to have a positive attitude and is happy to be there. And I think that everyone has experienced being on teams where it's really a drag to be at the rink. And, you know, when you're losing some games, like, it really can turn that way quickly. And I think our team has really rallied together to be like, no, we still got this. And that comes from our leadership group, and it trickles all the way down. And so you wouldn't know by showing up at the rink any struggles that our team might be going through. Like, we're really a tight-knit unit. And I think that's why we're confident that we're going to get the wins and outcomes we want to get. And then X's and O's wise, we love our PK. And so whenever we get a penalty, we're pretty confident that we're going to be able to kill it off. Our power play has been putting up numbers for us recently, which has been great and something that we had been focusing on in practice. And then our games are looking good. Like, sometimes you can look at the stat sheet and maybe think one thing, but when you're watching the games live, we really are feeling confident with our game and good about it. And so that's why there's a little bit of disconnect, and it's a little frustrating when the outside world might see something else. But like I said, we're kind of just trying to stay insular and stay with the program because we really trust our coach, we trust our leadership, and we trust ourselves. And so we're working hard in practice. We're working on putting in those final finishes around the net, really tightening up our defensive zone, protecting our goalies, going for the block shots. But practice has been looking good this week.
I wanted to come back to Detroit. We saw the Boston Fleet. They leaned into the whole Seattle of it all and kind of came in with fisherman outfits. I want to know, is there a team fit happening, or are you just going to go your own way?
Listen, I've had like an outfit that I've wanted to wear to this game since this game was announced. Ooh. So I will be wearing that outfit.
Ooh. Okay. All right. It's already picked out. I love it. Yeah. I love it. Cannot wait to see it. For fans that are coming through and maybe are not as familiar with the Detroit area, is there a spot that you recommend for food? I learn places through food and like independent bookstores, but that's a whole nother vibe. But is there a spot where you're like, hey, if you're in town, got to check it out?
I gotta pick one.
Well, I mean, okay. list them all, girl.
If you're looking for Detroit style pizza, because that's like something people are like, oh, what's Detroit style pizza? Buddy's is the place to go.
All right.
So that's on the pizza vibe. If you're looking for something very lesser known, but very Detroit like made, it would be a Coney Island. I grew up on Coney Islands. Oh. They are like these diners that have chili dogs and Greek salads. They're just like my favorite restaurants. And then there's American Coney Island and National Coney Island downtown, which is like they're right next to each other. And they both claim that they made the first Coney dog. And it's like this rivalry. So it's really fun to go try both of their Coney dogs. So that's a fun activity food wise. And then I love Tin Roof. They have bar food, but it's more for the vibes. There's like live music on the first floor. There's like a rooftop that looks over at Comerica Park. So that's another great spot if you're just wanting like a chill vibe. Certainly
for a podcast host, you have been a delight to get to know and to talk with. I love your vibes, love your energy. Cannot wait to see the fit. I'm super excited for that. Yes. But enjoy home, enjoy family and friends. It sounds like it's going to be a good time.
Yes, it's going to be. There's going to be a lot going on. It's a packed itinerary for sure, but I'm very excited. And I think that there's some fun things in the works with the Tigers, the Pistons, the Lions. So I'm like a kid in a candy shop right now. Like it's going to be so
my
we
goodness.
have to our game tomorrow, but then after that, kid in a candy shop.
I mean, I had such a great time, Rachel, catching up with Hartje. And I love the recommendations because like I said in the interview, I mean, that's how I like to explore new places. So we got you. If you're going to Detroit, Hartje gave you the spots. We'll make sure to put it in the show notes.
I would add one place to that list, the Caju Cafe in Detroit.
All right.
Yes.
Caju Cafe. There we go.
Really good spot.
I'm certainly jealous of everyone that's going to take in the takeover tour. But if I ever make my way out to Detroit, I now have some great recommendations thanks to Elle and our very own Rachel Donner. But coming up, we're going to talk about the Patty Kazmaier finalists, a little bit of the Frozen Four, and of course, we end every episode of the Women's Hockey Report, at least in the regular season, or while the season is while we're in season, with our game of the week. All of that coming up on today's episode. Today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Yeah, that's me more often than I like to admit. Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And if you are a business owner like me, then wanting to keep tabs on your cash flow and your income, your expenses is super important. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track your spending, and even plan long-term goals. And you'll find things you never knew about your spending habits. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL, for half off your first year. All right, Rachel, we have to get to our game of the week. Another important week for a lot of PWHL teams. But first, I'm going to do a quick run through of what we know happening in the NCAA world, including that we have our 3 finalists for the Patty Kaz, as it's known, Patty Kazmaier Award. That's for the best woman hockey player in the country. Izzy Daniel, who plays for the Toronto Scepters, won last year while representing Cornell. But this year, it's definitely going to be a Badger, because Wisconsin has 3 of the 3 finalists. And some of these players we've talked about on the show before, including, of course, Caroline Harvey, who is a defender, represents, of course, the United States. Casey O'Brien is a forward for Wisconsin. And then Layla Edwards, that, should she win, would only be the second ever Black woman to win the Patty Kaz. And that's pretty awesome. The first Black woman from the United States, though, to win the award. So that's going to be exciting. And remember, we asked Kendall Coyne-Schofield if she would have any involvement in the Frozen Four, since it will be in Minnesota. Well, when the Patty Kaz winner is announced, Kendall Coyne-Schofield and a few other alumna who have won the award will be on hand. So fans, you are able to attend that. If you want to, we can give you more details as that comes up, and check out the show notes as well. But the Frozen Four, so we had that first, the bracket has expanded a little in the last handful of seasons. So we had kind of that preliminary or regional, as they're calling it, semifinal. Wisconsin and Ohio State University, who had the first and second seed respectively, they didn't have to play in that first round, but their matchups are set. Clarkson beat Boston University, and they will take on Wisconsin. Minnesota is going up against Colgate. Minnesota, of course, is hosting the Frozen Four, so of course they want to be able to advance in this year's tournament. Cornell taking on Minnesota Duluth, and then the Ohio State University taking on St. Lawrence. St. Lawrence beat Penn State. Minnesota Duluth took care of Sacred Heart. And as we mentioned, Clarkson took care of BU, Boston University. This is going to be a good one. The top 2 teams, Wisconsin and OSU, have alternated, Rachel, winning the NCAA championship title, including the last 2 where they went head to head. But it is we're in 2025. And if you look at the odd years, it seems to go in favor of Wisconsin. So does that mean that they will be the 2025 champions? They're the number 1 team coming in. They only have 1 loss, Rachel. But of course, the only loss they had this season is to the one and only Ohio State Buckeyes.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, I think, just because it does seem like, just on paper, that Wisconsin has the easier path to the final this year. Now, that's all relative, because these are all very good teams, but I do think that is the case. The only possible exception being, again, to your point about Minnesota having extra motivation about wanting to play well on, in their home territory there. But I think, it's going to be a bit of a tougher fight for Ohio State. I think their game against St. Lawrence, I'm not worried about them for, but them facing the winner of Cornell and Minnesota Duluth, I think that's where the challenge is going to come into play for Ohio State.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting as well, because to your point about Minnesota, they would not meet Ohio State in their side of the bracket until the championship game, if it came to that. but
Right.
Minnesota was able to topple Ohio State in the WCHA semifinals. And of course, we
Mhm.
know that Ohio State beat Wisconsin this year. So does that give Minnesota, in addition to them knowing that they would host, does that also give them a little bit of an extra boost?
I mean, transitive property says yes, but, that's why we play the games, right?
Indeed, indeed. We're just the analysts and we get to look at all of the random patterns because they make for the drama. But it's going to be a good one. And although we do mostly focus on professional and international hockey here on the Women's Hockey Report, we're not going to miss the madness of March. That, of course, also includes women college hockey. So we will have you updated there. But let's get back to the pro game because we mentioned that Ottawa able to get a 3-2 win and in dramatic fashion, not just because of the Maschmeyer injury, but Ottawa was leading this game 2-0 and then had to really find a last minute goal to topple Minnesota to get that win. We also saw Montreal. They took on Boston, got that win, but lost to New York. So that snapped a skid for the New York Sirens. We heard from Elle earlier on the show. But I also think that, we have to take a look at this time in the season, Rachel, at who continues to be at the top of the table when it comes to scoring, because we will crown a scoring champion. It won't be Natalie Spooner. She just doesn't have as many games as, of course, the top scorers in the league coming back from injury, but it's a really tight race at the top.
Yeah, and I think, Sarah Fillier continues to perform really well despite being on a team that has not been as successful. And I think that's where the achievement is for her this year and kind of, I think, elevates her maybe above Hannah Miller in some ways, despite the fact that they're tied with the same number of points.
Yeah, 23 points. Those are your two leaders. I think it's interesting. I think Fillier is definitely going to pull some votes there. I don't know. I think Hannah Miller though has a solid case because if you look at it this way, would Toronto be able to be where they are in the standings? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. If it wasn't for the steadiness that Miller brought from a scoring perspective. And so on the one hand, you have a standout on a team that's not a contender. And on the other hand, you have someone that was steady and true for a team that then now finds themselves as a top two team. So we'll see how the votes go and who actually gets votes this year. And so we've got that going on. But let's talk about the games to come and what our picks will be for game of the week. We have another takeover tour stop. And I'm always a sucker for having that as my default. But let's go to you first, Rachel. When you're looking at the schedule and the slate of games coming up, what's the game that you have circled?
Yeah, for me, it's today's matchup between Boston and Ottawa. And I think for Ottawa, trying to rally after the Maschmeyer injury, obviously Gwyneth Phillips is a tremendous goaltender to have step up to the plate here. But, with Boston having 2 games this week to really maybe get some ground here and Ottawa trying to claw their way in, I think this is a really important matchup for both teams.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think also I'm kind of looking to see what we're going to get from Montreal, Boston. So, Montreal is leading at the top of the table, 44 points. Toronto with 36 points in second place, Boston with 35. So while the head-to-head, Rachel, is not going to impact Montreal, so to speak, it could have a massive impact for Boston. And they're going to want to be able to play well in that game and take control and command of their own destiny, so to speak, even regardless of what Toronto does. But looking at, we talked about New York able to break their skid, and they did it against a Montreal team. So this is still a league where on any given night, you mentioned it earlier, that's why we play the games, right? So on any given night, things can really shake up. But Boston has 2 games in this week's schedule, and I think they're going to want to win these games outright And but New York can play spoiler here. And we heard what Elle said. This is a team that they are supremely confident in what they have going on, despite what the standings look like. And that's also pretty powerful for a team. And in the conversation, the full conversation, you're going to have to watch over the weekend. We'll drop this over the weekend. But Elle also did mention that, when it comes to some of the tiffs or grudges on the ice, some last a little longer than others. So even when you're out of the playoffs, but maybe you can spoil the playoffs for someone that you still have beef with. Saying.
Let's go. Love it.
I'm just saying. And of course, not only is the fit going to be right, but she's going to want to play very well in that game against Minnesota in her hometown. We heard how many folks she has coming to support her and the Sirens. So as I said, always a sucker for the takeover tour and just love what the league is doing there. And hopefully we'll get an announcement on if any of those takeover tour stops are going to be part of the PWHL expansion. But Rachel, another jam-packed episode. We talked about so much here, and we're getting down to crunch time. And not only that, but soon we're going to be able to talk more about international hockey. We already gave the USA rosters, and we know that Team Czechia is going to be super excited to host Worlds. As we mentioned, we got to talk to a lot of the Team Czechia players while we were in Raleigh, so we will have those interviews coming for you as well. But for Rachel Donner, my name is Erica L. Ayala, and you've been listening to the Women's Hockey Report. You can follow Rachel on the Locked On Flyers podcast as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And you can follow me as I am your host of the Locked On Kraken show. And Rachel also, you can find on Fridays on the Locked On NHL show. You can find those on YouTube and anywhere you listen to audio podcasts. But until our next episode of the Women's Hockey Report, enjoy the games. Enjoy Detroit if you are traveling for the takeover tour, and we will have you covered for all things women's hockey next Saturday. Enjoy your week, everyone. We'll catch you on the next episode.